You really cook beforehand, otherwise you could put it in the microwave and warm it up again, you know.
Oh, it's delicious.
So that's it. So it's smoked salmon and prawn tart.
That's a brilliant one. Thank you. We'll have it on the website as always, and it'll be on Airtel page 365 as well. Thank you, Olivia.
Thanks, Anna.
Flawless.
Brilliant stuff. Now, in our third look at mental health this month, we're looking at a disorder that affects 1 in 100 people. People who are often on the receiving end of severe stigmatisation and misunderstanding, surrounded by many myths and misconceptions. Professor Paul Fearn is here with the facts on schizophrenia. You're very welcome. Thanks for coming back. And also Brian Hartnett, who was diagnosed several years ago with schizophrenia. How many years ago now, Brian, is it?
It was 1996 that I was diagnosed. So it's 13 years ago.
13 years ago. I tell you, you have a lot of stories to tell. I'll talk to you in just a minute. But first, I'm going to start with you, Professor. The obvious myth, and only if I was correct on this recently, the split personality. Lay people describe schizophrenia. Oh, that's two personalities, isn't it? Is it?
In a word, no.
Okay.
People with schizophrenia are no more likely to have a split personality or multiple personalities than you or I. It's an unfortunate misnomer. In the same way as people with schizophrenia are not psychopaths, people often mistake the words psychotic and psychopath. Essentially, schizophrenia is a serious mental health disorder that, as you said, affects just less than 1 in 100 people in our society. And it's characterised by symptoms that involve some degree of loss of contact with reality, either temporarily or over the long term, such as hallucinations, hearing voices, or delusions, believing things that aren't really real.
We'll talk about the symptoms in a minute, but first, the actual terminology, what does it mean in schizophrenia? I presume it's a Greek or a Latin word.
Yeah, it strictly speaking means split nerve. It was a word that was
that describes it better, doesn't it? Split nerve than the actual word. You kind of think, okay, well, there's no personality mentioned there. But what's happening to the body when it happens?
What's happening to the mind?
What happens to the mind?
Well, I suppose there's a splitting of the psychic function. So, for example, people who hear voices, a person with schizophrenia who might hear voices, those voices are very real. They're not. They don't feel that they're necessarily imagining them. They have the same qualities as if you and I, as we are speaking to each other. So it's like a splitting off of reality and what's not real. But a person with schizophrenia might not be able, when they're actually acutely psychotic, as we say, to tell the difference.
Okay, I understand it better now. Brian, tell me your story.
Well, I suppose my first experience of schizophrenia was in the late 80s. I went to London and I was working over there, and I started to hear voices. And I had these voices I still have them. I've always had them since. It's nearly 20 years now that I have my voices.
Do you have them now as you're talking to
Yeah, they're there all the time. There's always a presence and always a feeling that I'm connected and that, that I have this added dimension to my life, And that's my personal experience of schizophrenia.
It's a very good description, I have to say, of it. No offence to the professor, but that's a very good. The personal description is very. So you've learned to cope with the voices, and yet have stability in the sense that you're functioning, you're working, you're getting married next year.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Well, I suppose it's important for people to know that schizophrenia doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. Yeah. It is something that you can get through. You can learn to live with it. Again, my personal experience is one of hearing voices. Other people would have other types of experiences as well.
I'll talk about that. What other symptoms could occur to other people? What kind of things happen?
Well, we generally divide the symptoms into what we call positive and negative symptoms.
Yeah.
Positive symptoms are things that you have in addition that you normally wouldn't have if you're well, such as I mentioned, hallucinations, hearing or seeing things that aren't really there, or delusions, being convinced that something is real.
Okay, but they're not necessarily, as you said, they're called positives, so they're not necessarily a threat.
No. The positive refers to something that's there that usually wouldn't be if you're well. Whereas negative symptoms are things that you would normally have, but when you're unwell you don't have, such as lack of motivation or difficult losing interest in things that you used to be interested in, losing your network of friends, becoming quite isolated. And it's actually those symptoms, the negative symptoms, that are actually in many ways more challenging.
Is it lonely? Do you refer to it as a condition or an illness for you, Brian? What are you comfortable with as a term?
Well, I suppose for me, the experience has developed over the years. Initially, when the voices started, it was very confusing because I couldn't differentiate between real voices.
Like me talking to you and then...
Yeah, we could be having a conversation, we'll say, and there would be a lot of other voices and conversations going on as well. So it would be quite hard for me to follow your conversation. And sometimes I would imagine that, you could, read my mind, or I could read your mind, or, there was a lot of confusion.
Right.
But over the years, it developed to such an extent where I could actually separate the two.
It was brilliant.
So now I can, it's like, I weave in and out basically between the two levels, reality and this inner world.
Was it lonely for you, that place, when it was really bad? Was that a lonely place?
It was really, because I suppose for a long time I was afraid to talk about it. I wasn't too sure what was going on. I felt that somehow talking about it would get me into trouble with the voices, that I could be under threat almost.
Were they aggressive with you? Were they giving out?
Some of the voices were. I mean, there were many different types of voices,
And were they more dominant over you than you over them, or did that vary?
It really was a very varied experience throughout, I mean, there was good, bad and indifferent. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle the experience at all. It was very, very painful and very, very disruptive. And it completely changed my life, and everything changed when I came back to Ireland. I had to kind of start all over again, and I ended up working in the area of mental health, which was probably a good thing as well.
Which is fantastic, because now you can tell your story and you have the confidence to tell it, like we had last year, the case study last week, I should say, when she came on and spoke about postnatal depression. So many people could relate to it. Does it ever get very violent and very aggressive? Did it for you, Brian?
When you say,
did you ever have a bad episode that got very violent or very aggressive?
It can be very frightening. I mean, when you hear voices, you wonder where they're coming from. I mean, the initial thing would be to think like, are these voices of the dead or something? Are they?
So we would think like that. We couldn't help it. We think ghosts and things like that.
Well, you also think of like you go through different scenarios, like telepathy, for example. That somehow I can hear your thoughts. For me personally, my experience, as I say, of voices has come down to basically I feel that I have a spiritual connection and that these voices are real people as such, and I get through the day with that scenario, and that's
good, and
that's
that
what
works for you.
me.
That works for you,
I think
absolutely.
it's important to mention about the violence that you brought up, Norman, that there is this misconception that everybody with schizophrenia is violent, and it's portrayed in the visual media, cinema,
etc. But it's portrayed in movies, which they have a lot to answer to. It is often portrayed in movies.
But the fact of the matter is that people with schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. There is a small increased risk if you have schizophrenia of being violent, but it's a very small, it's less than 1% of all violence.
Would I be right that victim is often as a result of misunderstanding or a bit of paranoia or mixed with, translation?
They might be terribly frightened of something temporarily.
Okay, let's talk about why this happens. What happens? I know you're not going to be able to give me the one answer, but give me a generic idea of why this happens to people.
Well,
does it happen to more men or women?
The men seem to have about 1.5 to 2-fold increased risk compared to women.
Wow.
Yeah. It most often comes on in late adolescence up to mid-20s, although it can come on at any age.
Yeah, well, we've heard about late teens being diagnosed with this. So what do you think the cause are? You work on the field every day. You deal with these people.
Yeah, well, like most of the conditions we talked about in the last few weeks, there are multiple causes. Genetics play a role. We're beginning to discover some of the genes that are involved. There are going to be lots of genes involved. When we find them all, there could be as many as 100. You and I, sitting here, probably have some of them in our cells as we speak, but we need other risk factors in addition to those to actually develop the disorder. Social causes appear to be to have some things.
Drugs, alcohol,
drugs, yes, indeed. Interestingly, cannabis, which we've long known was associated with schizophrenia, but we used to think that people maybe smoked cannabis in order to get relief of symptoms.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, but in fact, the cannabis, there now have been very high-quality studies over the last 5 or 6 years, all of which pretty much show that there's about a 2-fold increased risk if you smoke cannabis of developing schizophrenia. And particularly if you start smoking before the age of 14, you've got a 4 to 5-fold increased risk. And of course,
it's funny because it's so ironic. That's regarded as a soft drug.
Well, we all regard it as a soft drug, but the cannabis that's on the street nowadays is several orders of magnitude stronger than the cannabis that was around in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's almost a different drug.
There's another chat to be had about that. Stress and trauma, family problems. What do you mean when you say childhood deprivation? What does that mean? How could that cause it? Or does issues with your childhood
Well, there's an association between, for example, we did a study in London looking at whether if you were separated from your parents for traumatic reasons for a year or longer, one or both parents, you had about a 2.5-fold increased risk of ultimately developing schizophrenia. Now, we weren't saying that childhood separation per se, but it's an indicator that maybe early childhood adversity, in combination perhaps with genetic factors, may additionally increase the risk.
Now, I'd imagine the biggest question is, how do you diagnose it? Is it easy? Brian, was that a tough journey to get someone to give you a name for this and help you with this?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I was hearing voices for about 7 years before I went to a psychiatrist. Why I didn't go, I don't know. I suppose at the time for me, you see, it didn't seem like it was a psychiatric or a mental condition. For me, it was a very real experience. It was part of my life.
So you didn't see it as a problem because you were living with it. That must be very common, Professor.
Well, he would have seen it perhaps as a problem, but he wouldn't have necessarily seen it as being unreal and therefore needing treatment. I'm presuming that, and I might be wrong, Brian.
Okay. I'm worried I'm going to run out of time. I just want to get to treatment, Brian, because so many people are watching could relate to what you're talking about, and maybe a lot of people have just been diagnosed. So for you, what treatment worked for you and what works every day for you?
Well, it's a combination of things. For me, well-being now is a combination of being strong in 3 areas, my mind, my body and my soul. And I have to look after those 3 things if I have to have well-being. I am on a small dose of medication, and I'm doing well on that, but I would hope to get off medication eventually.
And recovery is possible.
We reckon about 1 in 5 people who are diagnosed with having schizophrenia have 1 episode and recover.
That's fantastic.
And
I didn't know that.
Brian, in a sense, has recovered. He's still actively hearing voices, but he is working, he is engaged, he's getting on with his life, you know.
Absolutely.
So there is recovery of various sorts.
Okay, there's so much we didn't get to, and we knew we wouldn't. I know we had 11 minutes, sounds like a lot of time, but it wasn't in the end. I just want to quickly go through some of the symptoms in case people relate to them. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganised, maybe in work and in personal areas, withdrawal, loss of motivation, loss of feelings, depression, and loss of insight. They're just some of the symptoms. Now, if you're in any way interested and want to look up any of this information, go straight to our website, rte.ie/The Afternoon Show. And like everything, Brian left it 7 years. It was probably 7 years too long. I don't know if you'd say that now, but would you?
I don't know. I mean, I've been through the whole thing with medication, and it never stopped my voices, you know. So
you've learned to cope, though.
Yeah, I live with
which
mine.
is great. Well done, and good luck with the wedding.
Thanks very much.
Professor, thank you so much for coming in. Shana.
Excellent. Now, earlier, obviously,